If you spent any amount of time in the church or around the church, then you've probably been negatively affected by some of the unhealthy attitudes and mentalities that exist within our churches. I think it's time that we identify and address some of these unhealthy attitudes and biases so that we can dismantle them in a biblical way. Now, the goal is never to tear down the church, but only to build it up. And I think the only way that we can make our churches healthier and stronger, the only way we can make our churches more vibrant places of worship, the only way that our churches can grow and progress in the way that I think God would want our churches to grow and progress is to learn to accept that our churches aren't perfect. In the workplace, in the corporate world, many of our employers require that we go through these mandatory trainings regarding harassment, discrimination, diversity, sensitivity. And the purpose of going through all of these trainings is to make our workplaces healthier, more productive environments. Now, for the church, it's not just a matter of taking what we learn at our jobs and trying to force it on the institution of the church. It's really a matter of discipleship. It's learning to grow. It's growing. It's identifying places, areas of growth. And it's taking those areas, taking those issues and applying what we learned from the Bible, applying the wisdom of God and growing out of some of the things that have plagued our churches. One of the things that I think that we need to address is the issue of tenure bias. Now, there are tons of biases and attitudes that we could talk about within the church, and I hope that we'll have time to talk about them in the future. But tenure bias is the disregarding, disrespecting, or devaluing of people because of their lack of experience or tenure with Christ or within the church. Tenure bias is a very popular one in all of our churches, especially because most of our churches are comprised of older people. Now, older people aren't the only ones who are given to this sort of bias within the church as an institution. Younger people can too, because tenure bias basically says that because I've been with the church, because my family has been with the church, because I've held this position within the church longer than you have been acquainted with the church or with Christ, then I'm more valuable than you. Tenure bias is an unhealthy attitude. It's an unhealthy way of thinking because it breeds harmful interactions between those who are new to the church and those who have been in the church. And so, we got to ask ourselves, how does something like this, how does an attitude like this, how is it cultivated within God's place of worship? How is it cultivated amongst a community of believers? Well, the church has to function as an institution at times in order to best steward its resources. Now, tenure is only an idea within an institution, and sometimes the church has to function as an institution in order to be good steward of all of its resources. This idea of church as an institution is sometimes necessary because these systems within the church, the organizational structure of the church, the resources of the church have to be used appropriately and in a godly way. And the church as an institution gives us the organizational structure that we need to be good stewards of all of those things. But here's where tenure bias becomes an issue. Tenure bias becomes an issue because we began to believe that our time with the church, our time of service, our position within the church, our family's history with the church, all of those things somehow merit us a more favorable position in the eyesight of God. Tenure bias is ultimately a denial of the grace of God. Because when we remember that it does not matter how long we've been with the church, how long we've been serving, it doesn't matter. None of those things have secured our salvation, only the blood of Jesus Christ. So ultimately, tenure bias is a denial of the grace of God because everything we have, everything we are, is all of grace. So it really cultivates in our carnal minds because we think that our tenure, our time, our experience causes us to be more valuable than those who don't have our tenure. How does it look? And we need to talk about how tenure bias manifests itself in the church so that we can identify it and dismantle it in a healthy way. Oftentimes tenure bias manifests itself in ministries who are ran by people who have been sitting as a chair or president, as a lead, as the head of that ministry for a long time. And after a while, they began to feel as though their experience makes them omnipotent or omniscient in their knowledge, that their time and their tenure is more valuable and more important than the talents of those who they serve with or who they work with. Tenure bias causes us to micromanage every little thing in the ministry, and we don't give people the freedom or the latitude to exercise the gifts that God has given them. And sometimes when we fail to appreciate those talents and those gifts that God has given others, we fail to do the very best that we can in whatever effort we are endeavoring. Tenure bias causes us to turn a deaf ear to those who may have something helpful to say. Oftentimes we may not say this out loud, but when a younger Christian or when a newer Christian has something to say in a meeting, in the back of our minds, we always say, yeah, I know you have talent, but I have tenure. And as much as we like to criticize the commitment of younger Christians, we also have to take some responsibility for that, because our tenure causes us to diminish their role or their input in meetings, in ministries, to being seen and not being heard. And so we wonder why people leave the church. Well, people will go where they feel welcome, but they'll only stay where they feel valued. And so when this idea of tenure, this idea of experience making me more valuable than your talent, or my experience, my tenure makes me more valuable in the eyesight of God because you don't have the experience with Christ. You don't have the experience with the church that I have. It's an ultimate denial of God's grace, but it also prevents us from being a healthy church. I think one of the subtle ways that tenure bias expresses itself is in that very popular statement that the youth are the future of the church. Now, I know that statement is well-meaning, and most of the time it is well-intended, but it always causes me to ask the question that if the youth are the future of the church, do they have a place right now in the church? And oftentimes we look at younger or newer Christians as having a place in the church in the future without really trying to figure out where they stand with the church right now. And so I think that we have to dismantle this idea that our tenure makes us more valuable, that God can't do anything in the church without us because we've been there so long. And tenure bias ultimately makes us embittered towards younger generations especially. But here's what we have to remember, that God can raise up a generation to replace us without our consent. God does not need our consent to raise up young people who can work and serve in the church. And we always have to be mindful of that. One of the marks of a good leader is someone who is constantly trying to identify the next leader. And I think that it's impossible for us to engage in that identification process if we are given to tenure bias. Tenure bias is a fear of being replaced by someone who is younger or newer than us. But I think there's a solution to tenure bias. In Psalm 145:4, the psalmist says that one generation will commend your works to another and declare your mighty acts. And so what that helps us to understand is that we shouldn't be at odds with each other because of our tenure, time, and experience in the church. We should work to understand that we each have equal value. And although our works may look different, we're all working toward the same purpose, and that is to declare the glory of God among all the nations. God bless you.